So welcome everybody. Looks like we are live now, so you should be able to see just a real short slide deck that we're going to go over really quickly. Then we'll kind of dive into some introductions and then just open up the floor for general purpose questions, and we'll just kind of dive into whatever topics the audience is interested in talking about. So to interact with us, as you've probably done in other sessions, there should be a Q&A chat in your Microsoft Teams. And so you can just use that chat to ask questions. We've got a moderator who will be fielding them, publishing them. I'm kind of monitoring the chat, and so is Kevin. So we'll pick them up as they show up. Feel free to post anonymously if you'd like, or you can use your name. Either way is totally fine. Upvote other questions just using the like sign, so that'll give them a little more visibility if the chat ends up filling up a lot. And just please don't spam the chat. We do have some moderators who are going to try to field everything, so try to reduce the noise as much as possible. And of course, we've got a code of conduct. We're not going to read it word for word. Be nice. That is our biggest thing, at least in our own Prefect community, which we will talk a little bit about later. But just be nice and act responsibly here. It's a professional environment. So I guess with that out of the way, let's dive into some introductions. So my name is Chris White. I am the CTO at Prefect. I've been with Prefect since day one. So I've seen all the iterations we've done of our platform and our tooling. We'll go into all those different pieces probably throughout this chat. And now oversee architecture, platform development, and our product roadmap. And so actually, speaking of code of conducts and speaking of community, I'd like Kevin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Kevin Ko. I'm the open source community engineer at Prefect, which means I'm primarily responsible for answering questions in the Slack channel and creating content, community interaction. So the reason why Chris was bringing up that we have a code of conduct ourselves is that for every avenue where we interact with our community, we really emphasize the point of being nice. And as you join our Slack channel, you always get a code of conduct that just outlines some ground rules of interacting with each other. And yeah, that's it about that's it I have.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. And so on that note, just to kind of kick us off here, if there's any sort of question that you feel wasn't answered today, or if you really want to dive into Prefect the tool and start experimenting, highly encourage you to join our Slack community. We'll find a way to get you a link to that community, during this chat. But please join. There's thousands of other, users there. All of the Prefect engineers, including Kevin, are there, and Kevin is our main moderator, so you'll almost certainly be able to interact with him directly. But yeah, you can go, ask any technical question you want, get a better sense of what other people are working on, best practices, etc. And actually, it looks like we can get that link to you right now. So yeah, I guess Kevin, if you could grab that link and drop it in the chat for folks, that would be great. And yeah, I guess another little side benefit of that is it is a very active data engineering, data science community, and so things like job postings, cool new blog posts, and cool new technologies coming out are all displayed in various places in the various channels that we've got. So to kind of set us up with some context, while we're waiting on, whatever topics you all want to hear the most about, let me just tell you a little bit about what Prefect is, what we do, how we deploy our software, and just how we think about our space. So Prefect is a unique orchestration tool designed primarily for data-intensive workflows, although there's no inherent reason you can't use it to do other things. So just as an example, internally, we use Prefect to just schedule some various Slack reminders for ourselves, some various weekly events that we have, just scheduled postings about that. So there's no inherent need for you to do data-intensive work, but that is our primary audience. And the way Prefect, the reason I say Prefect is a unique orchestration framework is because we deliver our software in a somewhat unique way. So there's essentially two components to Prefect. One is an open source Python package. So that's the thing that you can go out there and download right now, start playing with. And that package is intended for developing Python-based workflows. So you can, and by develop, you can build it, you can run it locally, you can write tests for it, etc. You can run some type checks on it, whatever you need to do. And then there's, of course, this moment where you have to, quote unquote, deploy it or productionize it. And that's really where our platform, Prefect Cloud, comes in. Now, the unique aspect is that Prefect Cloud, the best way to probably think about it is an API. It is an orchestration API. And so you register the existence of your workflow with the API, but you are actually fully in control of your execution environment and the data that you're manipulating throughout your workflow. So that all runs on your own private infrastructure, but is orchestrated through API calls to Prefect Cloud. And we call this separation our hybrid model. We've written blog posts about it. Definitely go check it out. And I think what you'll find is, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You get that full deep configurability of your environment. You can throw as many resources as you want at it. You can deploy to any location that you want. We see people in Kubernetes on just standalone VMs, AWS Fargate, et cetera. The world's your oyster. But while getting all the benefits of, what the orchestration API provides. So automatic retries, observability, asynchronous scheduling, triggering your workflows based on event arrivals, et cetera. Okay, so I'll take a pause there. Looks like questions are starting to stream in. And so let me just read the question for everyone. I'm not sure exactly what screen everyone is looking at, and then we'll kind of dive into it. So I have a client, and we are heavily using Airflow. Airflow, for those who don't know, another very popular orchestration tool, also written with Python in mind. One of my big gripes with Airflow is how inflexible it is, specifically around starting workflows in different places. I.e., let's say I have a pipeline and I want to start it from task 3 instead of task 1. Does Prefect support this? Okay, this is an excellent question. So we're very familiar with Airflow. And in fact, just a little history here, the founder of Prefect, Jeremiah Lowen, was originally one of the core contributors to Airflow for many, many years. And he was on the Airflow PMC, and he helped guide that project a lot. But in his own work, when he started to find, places where he needed to scale out more, or, questions like this, Airflow was very inflexible because it was designed for a very specific use case, right? Orchestrating Hadoop jobs. And it does that really well, regularly scheduled ones as well. And so that's kind of Prefect's origin story, if you will. And we can talk more about that later, but that's just kind of the gist. So we're very familiar with Airflow. And so, okay, can you start from the middle of a workflow is essentially what the question is. The answer is a little complicated. You can achieve this. It is definitely achievable. It does require a little bit of work on your part, though. And there's a very specific reason for this. Prefect exposes dataflow as a first-class pattern. And so what I mean by that is you write a Python function and it has a return statement. Maybe that return statement returns a pandas data frame, for example. That data is then passed in memory downstream to a downstream dependency, assuming it has one. And so to start a workflow from that downstream dependency requires some injection of where to get the input data from. And so that is the small bit of complexity that does exist in Prefect for when you want to run a workflow from an arbitrary location. The most common pattern we see to solve for this is Prefect has a very rich conditional API. So you can build workflows that have lots of branching logic baked into them. And those branches, we see a lot people configuring them based on parameter values. So parameterization is another first-class thing in Prefect. And so what we see is they'll have branches that, this branch tends to not run very frequently. So let's just wait for someone to tell us to run it through a parameter value. And that's the most common way people will do, different pieces of workflow runs. And I guess one other thing that I should say, just because it's such a ridiculously popular pattern, is the ability to, build dependencies of workflows. So if you have different pieces of common logic that you can represent as a workflow in and of itself, then you can build a dependency tree of those workflows as well. And then, of course, kick off each one individually or as a whole. Kevin, anything else to add there? And yeah.
No, not that. Yeah, that is one of the most common patterns, that we see of using subflows and like Prefect orchestrating other Prefect jobs. And if your code is structured in a modular way, then you can just have task 3 already be its own flow and Prefect and be called by an outer flow that's also orchestrated by Prefect. And then that way you can run task 3 individually if you want to. You can also run the whole flow if you want to.
Yeah, and this is something too that, you know, we've heard this exact request a few times, and so almost certainly we'll expose a first-class API for just saying, just run this one task, but we're kind of, you know, still collecting and doing some user research on that. So we do have another question that I want to get into because it speaks directly to why we built the hybrid model. So the question is, how to deal with personal data or PII information when you consume data with Data Factory. So lucky for you, Kevin is our resident Azure Data Factory expert, and he actually did a Microsoft talk last week, I believe, comparing Prefect with Data Factory. So I will hand this over to Kevin in just a minute, but I want to highlight one thing about the hybrid model that is very relevant here. We built this hybrid model so that you own execution, we manage orchestration through API for a lot of different reasons, one of which is security and data privacy concerns. So we have a lot of HIPAA compliant customers that have this exact sort of concern. And the API, by default, I should at least, interacts purely in metadata. So what kind of metadata am I talking about? You have a job that you want to do something, like maybe manipulate some data, run an ETL job, something like that. We care about the surface area around that job. When did it run? How long did it run? Was it successful? Did it generate any logs? Those are the sorts of things that we will collect in the back end, but the actual data that you're manipulating, unless of course you choose to expose it to us, remains 100% inaccessible to Prefect Cloud and entirely on your infrastructure. So you don't have to worry about that sort of data leakage, but I am personally not deeply familiar with Data Factory. So Kevin, I'll hand it over to you for any sort of additional considerations there. And maybe you could just even speak to what it looks like to run Prefect and Data Factory together.
Yeah, so when I was in my last job, I was a data scientist, and we were really concerned about what stuff we can store on the cloud in general. So there's stuff that we wanted to keep on-premise servers. So the nice thing with combining Prefect and Data Factory is that Data Factory can kick off a Prefect job, and that Prefect job can run entirely on your on-premise infrastructure. So you don't need to upload the data that Prefect is working with. It just lives wherever you're running that workflow. So in that sense, we don't see, as Chris said, we only deal with metadata. We don't see any of that data or PII, personal identifiable information. And then second, the second part of that question is how you would use Data Factory and Prefect together. You can use Prefect as through the API, as I showed in my demo. So it's just a matter of sending a request to the Prefect API.
Sorry, just catching up on what's going on in the chat. Yeah, so kind of pause there. What other questions do people have? And, you know, just to be super clear, we're happy to dive into any aspect of this so we can talk more about orchestration, which actually I think I'm going to give a little bit more on in just a second, as well as just, you know, the PyData space in general, which we're really tapped into. So let me just talk a little bit more about orchestration, just for some additional context. So this is a word that everyone is familiar with. I think everyone kind of has a gut sense for what orchestration means, but the way that we really think about it, and you know, I'm going to keep repeating myself a lot here about this hybrid model, really is inspired by this view that we have of positive engineering and negative engineering. So positive engineering is the task that you want to achieve. Negative engineering is all the cruft you have to care about around that task to make sure that it succeeds. So things like setting up logging services, deployment infrastructure, dependency resolution, state management, all of that fun stuff. And that is where orchestration lives. And I actually encourage you, I actually gave a talk a few weeks ago at a different online conference. And so go, we have some questions streaming in that we'll get to. So go search Chris White. If you give a data engineer a job, And there's a talk on YouTube, go check it out. I dive really deep into, what we view as the crucial orchestration problem and why our architecture, is a genuine attempt at solving that. Okay, so do you have an architecture diagram or something to refer to? How does Azure Data Factory fit in? We do have an architecture diagram. If you go to docs.prefect.io, I will admit I don't remember exactly where in the docs that diagram lives, but you should be able to find it if you poke around, maybe in the orchestration section or the deployment section. And so where does Azure Data Factory fit into Prefect? So first and foremost, this is something, there's no inherent integration between the two that forces you to use one or the other. So the way that people use Data Factory with Prefect is kind of how Kevin was describing. Either you set up a Data Factory job that kicks off a Prefect workflow, which you can do through our API. So it's a simple post request, potentially with a authentication token, or vice versa. And I would, Kevin, definitely correct me if I'm wrong. I would argue that vice versa is probably the most common. So what I mean by that is you have some Data Factory jobs that you care about, but there's some other dependency in the world. Maybe it's a DBT job. Maybe it's a Fivetran job. I don't know what other services you may be using. Maybe it's just another Azure job. And you want to encapsulate a dependency, one way or the other between that Data Factory job and some other service. And that's really where Prefect comes into play. Because Prefect is so agnostic to the types of tools and services that you are using and deploying yourself, you can set up dependencies and essentially like glue between all of these different third-party services. And so basically, this might be a slight oversimplification, but you'll go to the Prefect Cloud UI and a Data Factory job will be one of the nodes in your workflow's dependency graph. And then there will be lots of other nodes corresponding to parameters, maybe producing some different artifacts, things like that. Yeah, Kevin, you know best about how this actually, looks in practice. Anything else to add to that?
No, so it's just a matter of using one as the macro level orchestrator and another one as the micro. And it can go both ways, right? Where Prefect is the macro level orchestrator that orchestrates Data Factory, or Data Factory be your macro that orchestrates Prefect jobs along with other Azure services. Sorry, just to add, this was I outlined this more in the on-demand session. So we will send out the link to that on-demand session also, so you can take a look at that.
Awesome. So getting a couple of questions with a somewhat common theme that I want to dive into. So I would say the theme here that I'm seeing is performance and parallelism and resource management. So questions about how does Prefect scale to parallel jobs or parallel workflows, and how to deal with potential multi-threading within your jobs, questions like that. So and how wide can a Prefect flow get before you should consider subflows? Okay, I have a lot to say about this. So we designed Prefect with scale in mind on day one. And this is really encapsulated in one of Prefect's most popular features, which is task mapping. So what is task mapping? Task mapping is, mapping is a common paradigm across a lot of different data science frameworks. So this shouldn't be a surprise to you, but it allows you to take a task, feed it a list of inputs, and then map over those inputs to create individual dynamically spawned task runs corresponding to each input. First off, this is unique in the orchestration space, although we are seeing, a lot of people starting to pick up on this, because each of those runs is independently retryable, independently schedulable. They're true first-class dynamically spawned, orchestrated runs. And we're going to be pushing the envelope on that much further. The reason I bring up mapping, though, is this is how a lot of people really tap into super wide Prefect flows. And absolutely no exaggeration, we have seen people map over hundreds of thousands of things within a single workflow run. Now, that is not the most common thing, because at the end of the day, you might not need that level of granular visibility into that many different things. So people might start batching them and consolidating a little bit. But the sky is the limit when it comes to scale and Prefect. You really can create flows that are essentially arbitrarily wide. And the biggest bottleneck, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this to speak to the multi-threading question, the biggest bottleneck is going to be the execution environment that you're deploying to. So if you deploy using our single-threaded executor, for example, you're not going to get any parallelism. So you can still spawn that many tasks, but they're going to run sequentially. And so you're going to be waiting for a long time. To really get the power of that parallelism, what most of our users will do is they'll use our Dask executor against a Dask cluster. So for those who aren't familiar, Dask is a distributed framework written entirely in Python, really, really popular for data science in particular. And so, yeah, you would just have to spin up a quite large Dask cluster to get that sort of parallelism within a single workflow. And let me just say one other thing before I move on to a few other questions I'm seeing. So there's no, we don't have a particularly strong recommendation for how to structure your flow. It really depends on the level of visibility and observability you want into the tasks. If you see a red node in that graph corresponding to failure, I always encourage people to ask, is that meaningful to you? And if not, then maybe try to consolidate it into a slightly larger task. But at the end of the day, you can make your tasks as small and bite-sized as you would like. And you can make your flows essentially as large as you like, although there are a couple minor caveats there about how large a static graph can be, but dynamic graphs can be quite large. And yeah, I guess we have a lot of other questions streaming in, so maybe I'll kind of pause on that. But yeah, parallelism fully supported, both at the workflow level and within your individual workflows. So,
I want to add.
Go, Kevin.
Yeah, I want to add that as Chris mentioned, Prefect is really strong in mapping. Like going back to the previous question, Prefect can extend Azure Data Factory in certain ways, and mapping is one of them, where you can have a lot of dynamicism involved with your DAG, and you can also have scale out much more compared to like drawing each of those or like doing a for each inside Azure Data Factory.
Yeah, mapping was something that we knew we wanted to build, and we built it. Had no idea how popular it was going to become, which is always a pleasant surprise. So I have a couple of questions related to Prefect Cloud and how that kind of fits into the puzzle. Like, is it a requirement? Can you run on-prem without using Prefect Cloud? Can you just use Prefect Core alone, et cetera? So let's talk a little bit about kind of our product lineup, if you will. Prefect Core, you can run and schedule workflows with Prefect Core. Totally doable. You don't necessarily need anything else. However, for something that needs to be highly available or that you need really first-class visibility into, Prefect Core is definitely not going to get you there. Prefect Core is just going to run things in a Python process, simple as that. So, for certain use cases that aren't production grade, then maybe you get away with Prefect Core. You won't have a UI, you won't have any sort of observability. It'll just be, logging to a terminal, basically. But it is doable. You can run your workflow locally in an interactive Python session. And we encourage everyone to do that when you're first getting started, just to kind of get a feel for how things work and what the logs look like. Now, upgrading from there, we do have something that we call Prefect Server. And there is a CLI command built into Prefect Core that allows you to spin up a server deployment. It does require Docker and Docker Compose. Just want to flag that before you run into it. So make sure you have Docker running and Docker Compose installed. And it'll basically spin up a few containers. They're all networked to each other. And it exposes, similar to Prefect Cloud, an API that is, in this case, exposed on local host. So not distributed or anything fancy, but on local host that you can configure your workflows to talk to. Now that does come with a UI built in. So now you kind of have a little bit of increased observability, a little bit increased availability, because you can kind of see what's going on in a few different processes, et cetera. But it is intended largely for single network, single node, low scale deployments. There's no concept of user, no type of authentication. There's not a lot of performance hooks in there, but totally doable for single network, single node deployments, maybe at the scale of a single Airflow deployment, for example, or a little bit more than that. So it looks like we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and So we're gonna hang out for a little bit longer than our scheduled time. But so in short, you can use Prefect Core. You can spin up your own version of Prefect Server. There will just be some features and functionality that you won't be able to tap into, but that might be okay for your use case. So, go check it out. And then there is a question about, can you run on-prem without Prefect Cloud? And I just want to call out that question specifically because it kind of depends on what you mean by the word on-prem, right? You will always fully be in control of your execution environment, which will run on something that you own. So if you run in Azure Cloud, it will be inside your Azure Cloud VPC. You'll have full control over where those workflows are running, and they're just talking to the Prefect Cloud API. So depending on if that API request violates your definition of on-prem, some people consider the deployment a hybrid on-prem SaaS deployment. So let's see.
Can I just add there? Yeah. There is a common misconception that since server is open source, that is like the only free offering that we have. But I just want to remind everyone that if you sign up for Prefect Cloud as well, you do get 10,000 free task runs, successful task runs every month. So it's also a great way to get started without having to spin up server on your own infrastructure.
Yeah, and that's a great call out, Kevin, because I really do recommend for a developer experience purposes, starting with that free tier Prefect Cloud before you go to server. You definitely may choose that you need server for whatever reasons related to control or audit. That's totally fine. But for the purposes of onboarding yourself into the Prefect ecosystem, it is so much easier to use Prefect Cloud first, get a feel for how it works, and then make that decision afterwards, as opposed to the other way around, which I see a lot of people doing and running into some hiccups when they do it. Okay, so let's see some other questions here. So what would be the best way to work with a legacy workflow mainly running cron jobs with MATLAB functions? I love this question because one of the things we really try to do, and whether or not we succeeded or not, I'll leave that up to the audience, but we really try to build Prefect in a way that allows for very iterative development. So you can kind of opt into the features as your workflow grows in complexity. So for something like that you already have set up as a cron job that runs MATLAB functions, there are essentially two things that you would need to do to migrate that to a basic Prefect deployment with no fancy bells and whistles. So first off, identify whatever the script is that cron job is running. If that script is already written in Python, then you're 90% of the way there. You tuck it inside of a function and then put that into a Prefect flow. Shouldn't be more than indenting some code and adding like 3 lines of Prefect. If it's not written in Python, then you might want to do something like import our shell task from our library and then wire it up to call that endpoint. But either way though, you don't have to make a complex workflow to use Prefect. So you can be a single task workflow, same endpoint as your cron script is calling, and then just use a local agent. So agents are a thing in Prefect, which essentially corresponds to your execution environment. So just use a local agent and then import a cron schedule, put a cron schedule in your flow, and you've completely replicated having a cron job, except now you've got logging, visibility, notifications on failure, and all the stuff that cron doesn't natively ship with very minimal overhead. So definitely recommend playing around with that sort of migration path. So does Prefect provide enterprise support packages? Absolutely. Music to my ears question. Feel free to reach out. Email sales@prefect.io. Include the fact that you're a Microsoft build. We'll definitely hop on a call with you and show you all of our support packages. I do want to reiterate though that our Slack community, totally free, thousands and thousands of active users in there, including Kevin, including myself. So that is, a first order level of support that you can always get without even having to talk to us. But we do have, more extensive versions of support, email support, tiered support, etc. All right, let's see. So we want to create an orchestration framework for Synapse integration pipeline. Can we use this framework to deploy with an Azure Synapse? Kevin, are you?
Yeah, So there's a previous question also about how do exceptions that we kind of missed. How do exceptions get bubbled up when you use Azure Data Factory and Prefect together? And the example was a Databricks job. I think anytime you use two orchestration frameworks together, one as a macro and one as a micro, it's very hard to bubble up the logs in general. I would say in that scenario, you may want to just probably stick to one service, maybe just orchestrate with Prefect. Prefect could give you the granularity of those like Databricks jobs and the errors associated with them. But in general, when using two orchestration frameworks together, you don't get that kind of bubbling up of logs. The second part of that question is failure handling. In that sense, Prefect does give you a lot of tools for failure handling. Do you want a notification? Do you want the flow to continue or take another route? Do you want like downstream tasks to still run if stuff fails? So there's a lot of failure handling options in Prefect for sure. That can like the most common I've experienced with Databricks is like it just fails to start and it just needs a simple retry. Prefect can help you with that for sure. Second question here is the Synapse integration. I haven't used Synapse myself, but my understanding of Azure Synapse is that it is a ETL kind of data warehouse kind of. You can use Spark and SQL to run ETL jobs. In this scenario, I think Prefect would be the macro level orchestrator in moving those Azure Synapse jobs, especially when you have non-Azure resources that you also want to deal with and combine with your Azure hosted data.
Awesome. Thanks, Kevin. And so there is, I know we're kind of over time and everyone has, busy schedules to go to some other talks and everything. There's another question that I wanted to just kind of not directly answer because I honestly don't have a direct answer for it. But so the question is, do you anticipate Prefect services to be available on Azure Gov? So I can't tell you all the different ways in which Prefect is going to show up around Azure. We do already have Prefect agents on the Azure Marketplace, and we're going to be rolling out more configuration for those agents. So those agents are specifically for Prefect Cloud. Highly recommend go play with those. Go give us feedback. We're always open to feedback. But the big thing that I wanted to address with this question is that we are, and I'm not sure that we ever said this or if it's implicit, but we are in the Microsoft for Startups program. We're a partner with Microsoft, so we are definitely working together on different ways of getting Prefect, into the Azure ecosystem in a more first-class way. So Prefect services will definitely be showing up in more places around Azure. Whether it's on Azure Gov specifically or not, I can't necessarily say. But we're definitely going to be more and more around. And definitely just keep a lookout on the Azure Marketplace for Prefect related things, because that's definitely where we're focused in the short term. I guess with that, Kevin, anything else that you wanted to call out or mention from any of these questions?
Nothing to call out, but something we tell everyone is that just join our Slack channel. Like there's a lot of interesting discussions going on. Even if you just want to check out, just have a few like initial questions, like you're unsure about using Prefect, definitely join and we'll pick up the discussion from there.
Yeah, that sounds great. I hope to see a lot of folks from this showing up in Slack. And oh yeah, so we do, sorry, I kind of have been focused on the chat window. We do have the links available right here on the slide, right in front of my face. And so check us out on the Build Sponsor website, get some more information. That'll link you to a lot of these links that are here. So to join our Slack, go to prefect.io/Slack. That will redirect you directly to our Slack community. Feel free to pop in, drop a hello in our introductions channel, and just start firing away with different questions. And then, of course, our website, prefect.io, where you can find all of our contact information. I'm Chris at prefect.io, so feel free to email me directly if you have any follow-ups from this. I'd love to connect and, enjoy the rest of your build experience. And thanks for stopping by.